Hello and Happy New Year. I'm Adam Shepherd.
And I'm Jane McCallion.
And you're listening to the ITPro Podcast, where for once we are not going to be suffering from a crippling New Year's Day hangover.
Or a New Year's disappointment. Yeah, for me, New Year's Eve is always just like, the clock strikes 12 and who cares? Maybe that's just because I'm a very bar humbug person.
You tend to like New Year's, I have to say.
Well, New Year, hopefully a bit of a refresh going into 2021.
Glad to see the back of 2020, frankly.
Yes. You know, as of 7 hours ago, when this podcast goes out, 2020, it's gone. So let's talk about what we can expect in 2021.
And sadly, COVID will still be with us in 2021 for, at the very least, the first quarter of the year. While vaccines have been starting to be rolled out, it's going to take a while before we fully see the effects of them, before we get everyone fully vaccinated and before life can return to normal, or at least some version of it.
Yes, the current estimate as we record, which you peek behind the curtain here, is actually in mid-December, is what, Easter, there or thereabouts, that we will be able to return to some semblance of normal, whatever that kind of looks like, really. But hopefully, well, at least the days will be getting longer and stuff. But yes.
So what that means is that we will still be doing the whole remote working Zoom meetings dance for another couple of months at least.
So I think from a tech perspective, what will be most interesting really is once COVID has largely subsided, what are we going to see in terms of the trends of the past? Well, it will be more than a year by that point. So will, kind of the use of, cloud stay the same more or less as it is now? How much are people going to return to the office? There's been a lot of talk of people sort of like abandoning bricks and mortar buildings, but I think that might be slightly overhyped. So for me, that's going to be a really interesting trend to watch, and I'm sure I'm not the only one there.
I think now that a lot of workers have experienced working from home in a kind of really sustained way rather than the odd day here and there, I think there's a lot of workers now who will be unwilling to go back to the office full time. And in fact, there have been a number of studies done over the course of 2020 which have shown that I think around 70% of the UK's workforce would prefer to do a hybrid model where they're only in the office 2 or 3 days a week and the rest of the time is working from home. And now, given that organizations have had to institute collaboration platforms and, video meetings and remote working out of necessity, there really isn't any excuse for them not to support that other than just saying we don't want to. And I think that's going to become a big differentiator for companies now. I think you're going to get a lot of workers saying, well, actually, you can support it, you're just choosing not to. And I'm going to look for another job where they will support that because that's the way that I want to work. And now I think it's going to be the norm rather than the exception as it previously has been.
Yeah, I think any argument, that there previously was about, oh, actually you can't work effectively or we can't contact you as much,
Yeah.
it's gonna evaporate because in many, many cases those, fears have just not been borne out at all. And for commuters, which many, many people are in this country, it's taken a huge load off. I was a very long distance commuter for a long time, and just the way that I work now, I just can't believe that I would get up at 4:30 and I'd be out of the house by 5:30. Just the idea of all this just seems crazy.
I mean,
What was wrong with me?
yeah, well done for catching on to what the rest of us were thinking for several years. You were the only one that didn't realize that was insanity.
Well, as I said at the time, you get used to it, and indeed, you get used to not having to do it as well. So, yeah, I think that the whole distributed office thing is here to stay. But yeah, I think there are also a lot of people who do want to go back into the office, at least to an extent.
Mm,
It'd be quite nice to see your lovely face and that of our other colleagues in person rather than through a screen. Because
mm.
not least because I'm pretty sure I'm getting too much eye strain by looking at you all on video. You're all slightly more gentle on the eyes, and I don't have to look at you through a flat screen.
Mm. Less pixelated, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But one of the really interesting things for me is what's going to happen over the next year in terms of digital transformation, because collaboration platforms like Slack and like Teams, for me, are the bedrock of a good digital transformation process. That's the kind of the foundational level on which you can layer
Mm,
other methodologies, other, SaaS and cloud-based technologies in order to achieve whatever your desired outcomes are. And that was the thing holding up a lot of companies. Rollouts of stuff like Slack and Teams and Zoom and all the rest of it are expensive and time consuming and require a lot of planning and whatnot. And previously organizations were looking at those projects, as we mentioned in our last episode, on a kind of 3 to 5 year timeline, whereas now they've had to enact it in, like, 2 months.
so it was
But
3 to
now,
5 minutes, yeah.
well, yeah, exactly. But now that all of that stuff is in place, companies can look at refining those deployments and making sure that they're doing what they need them to and what they want them to, but also they can start then building on those and using them as a jumping off point for further digital transformation processes, implementing things like DevOps, for
Mm,
example, or application transformation projects, serverless computing, all these kind of really interesting, fancy, transformational stuff now that they've got the kind of essential scaffolding, if you like, up
yeah.
and running.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, the like kind of the digital transformation has been sort of a 5 year plan so far. But it is also supposed to be a journey. So I want to see what this next step is. Because DevOps, to be honest with you, is not necessarily going to be applicable to every business. So
No.
for those, I guess, in the more SMB space who perhaps don't have internal development teams, which is a reasonable number of businesses. I'd like to see where that goes next, as well.
Mm,
I think it's quite an exciting time, actually.
yeah. What I don't think we're going to see is I don't think we're going to see any kind of significant rollbacks of
Mm.
the cloud tools that have been deployed. There has been some questions over this year about whether or not the pressing need for these platforms is taken away and businesses can go back to in-office work and in-person collaboration and all that kind of stuff. Whether we're going to see uh, deployments of things like Zoom and whatnot, shrinking back down again. I don't think we are, partly because inertia is a powerful force, and partly because I think businesses have really realized the benefits that these systems can have in a way that you really can't until you actually start using them in practice.
Yeah, they've proven their worth, and
Yeah,
it's sort of like at a company scale proof of concept. And yeah, I don't see them going away. Now, the other thing that is going to be big in 2021 is
the other thing that's not going away.
yeah. Well, who knows? Is Brexit. So, yeah, as mentioned, we're recording this before this has happened. So, congratulations or commiserations to you in the future on the deal or no deal that has happened, depending on what happens and your own feelings about the matter. But it's going to have a huge impact on business. Everyone knows that. And um, I think it really remains to be seen throughout 2021 and beyond what the real impact is going to be here, because just so much is unknown.
Yeah. So, from a tech perspective, the big considerations that people will be looking out for are things like talent.
Hmm.
How are businesses going to respond to a vastly decreased pool of European, skilled professionals in areas like software development, network architecture, all of these kinds of fields. Will we see more outsourcing using the remote collaboration platforms that we've spoken about? Will we
Mm.
have European team members who are working for British companies but aren't setting foot in the UK? Uh, Also, things like equipment supplies.
Mm.
If you're running your own data center, for example, are the tin, the servers, the storage arrays, the networking switches, all of that kind of stuff, are you going to be able to get the kit that you need in a timely fashion if it's manufactured overseas, stored overseas, imported from big manufacturing and distribution hubs in places like Germany and France? What's the impact going to be like on laptops, for
Yeah, I was
example?
gonna say it's not just data centers, it's laptops, it's phones, it's
Mm.
basically everything, yeah, anything that relies on logistics, import, export. This is, yeah, another big question. And I remember years ago, it might have even been 2016, maybe 2017, when I was at HPE Discover, and Meg Whitman, then the CEO, was very forthcoming about the fact that this, is potentially a problem for their business and for their customers. And yeah, it's a big question as much as it is for any other sector that involves a lot of import export.
And of course, the other major impact of Brexit, or potential impact rather, is data transfer.
Mhm.
Of course, at the moment, there is a substantial amount of data that flows in and out of the UK to Europe, to places like the US, and it's currently still unclear what the concrete impact of Brexit will be on all of that data flow. Are there going to be, metaphorical regulatory walls that come down in the first days of Brexit that mean that certain, services or businesses are, less viable to run because data needs to be stored locally in, local jurisdictions? Are businesses going to have to make more use of hyperscale cloud providers versus European colo centers, for example?
It's a really knotty issue. There are a couple of aspects to it. So there is no intention to change, UK data protection laws currently, at least, which align with GDPR. They brought the GDPR into British law.
In the form of the Data Protection Act 2018, if memory
Indeed,
serves.
indeed, or UK law rather. So, yeah, there's no intention to change that. So in theory, that should, allow a fairly smooth path to data transfer between here and the European Union, the EEC, being pretty straightforward. But it also depends on then how we set up any data partnership with the US, because my goodness, hasn't that been an ongoing saga as well?
Mm.
Trying to work out a way which is acceptable to the European Union for its residents' data to be stored in the US jurisdictions. So this goes back to Privacy Shield. It goes back to the very important case of the Irish data centre, um,
Mm.
with data that was stored in Ireland, but Microsoft had been served with a warrant for it to be extracted from the US. So big, big questions there, which poses real difficulties actually on UK businesses when it comes to data transfer, basically with other what are considered third countries from the point of view of the EU.
Mm. No doubt this is going to take multiple months of legal and regulatory finagling, uh, but until we have a clear outlook on what the rules are going to be, a lot of businesses will be effectively in limbo.
Mm.
So this decision is definitely going to be one to watch for the remainder of the year.
We're going to take a quick break now, but when we come back, we'll be talking more about what we think 2021 has in store for the IT industry.
See you after the break. Welcome back. Now, as we spoke about in our last episode, looking back on the events of 2020, the last 12 months have seen some really big mergers and acquisitions. And the next 12 months are going to be really interesting from the perspective of what those mergers result in.
Yes, so the two big mergers of 2020 were Nvidia, which is taking over Arm, and Salesforce, which is taking over Slack. Now, both of those happened right at the end of the year. So there has been no time really for anything much to happen, of any note. So 2021 is going to be the real test bed for those two, and they are big, big pickups.
Mm. No one really knows what either company is going to do with its new acquisitions in terms of roadmap, in terms of product integration. While we can make some fairly educated guesses, Nvidia, for example, is likely to continue to feed its work on AI and on machine learning with the technological might of ARM's processor footprint, while Salesforce is likely to weave Slack throughout its SaaS suite as a kind of connective tissue layer.
Mm.
We don't know much more beyond that, and we don't know anything for certain. No announcements have been made about the future of either organization.
Yeah, and I think that Salesforce's acquisition of Slack is not particularly controversial. NVIDIA and ARM is just
Mm,
like on lots of levels. On the one hand, it's kind of, there was the whole hoo ha about another British company, kind of being swallowed up by a non British entity, kind of ignoring the fact that it was already owned by SoftBank, which is a Japanese company as well.
mm.
Um, let's just skip over that. But, there is still this big question of, is it possible really for Nvidia to keep ARM vendor neutral, um, or is this going to become a problem?
I don't think it is. I mean, if IBM can make Red Hat work as an independent entity, which so far it seems to have done. The acquisition closed in July of 2019, and so far, touch wood, uh, Red Hat still seems to be operating in much the same kind of open, neutral way that it has done for decades and decades. So if IBM can pull that off, then I don't see any reason why Nvidia can't do the same. And in fact, Nvidia has less to gain from curtailing the openness of ARM's ecosystem and business model than IBM did for Red Hat. So I really can't see there being much of a change on that side. Uh, if anything, I think this will open NVIDIA out more rather than making ARM more closed off.
That's a really interesting take. But speaking of IBM, however, it's not merging, it's splitting. This year,
Mm.
it's spinning out a portion of its business into what is currently known as NewCo, but will not, thank God, be called
Name
NewCo once that
TBC.
happens. Yeah, basically. Um,
Insert name here.
yeah. So my point of view, which I wrote of my analysis of the situation, is that it's not as big a deal as people are making out. This is not an HPE, HP Inc. situation. It's spinning off a part of its business and to kind of laser focus on its strengths in AI and so on. So I don't think it's important, it's happening, but I don't think it's gonna be super impactful, if I'm honest.
So tell us a bit more about what the two companies are going to look like once the split happens. Which divisions are being hived off, and what's the logic behind it?
So yeah, what's happening is IBM is spinning off its managed infrastructure services unit into a separate entity. So there's possibly you knew that it had a managed infrastructure services unit, possibly you didn't. It's not fundamentally what you think of when you think of IBM. Um, the announcement at the time is that, IBM is going to be laser focused on the $1 trillion hybrid cloud opportunity. So, that's how they're positioning it. But it's also important to note that the company, it's not putting all its data center and hardware, kind of pedigree and history in the bin either. That's still going to keep going. So if you're an IBM customer and that's the side that you're purchasing on, like, it's fine.
So here's the question for me. Have they split off the mainframe business as part of this? Is that going to be part of this new co?
Nope.
And there it is.
No, no.
The mainframe business, as we've spoken about a couple of times on this podcast, is bigger than you might think and growing to
Yeah,
boot.
yeah.
So, for all IBM's talk of being laser focused on hybrid cloud, it still has one foot very, very much in the, for want of a better word, legacy world of mainframes, because that is a business that still continues to make them huge amounts of money, and for very good reason.
Yeah, effectively, IBM just, it'll still be selling its hardware, but you won't be able to ask IBM to look after it and manage it for you. That is what this new co will be doing. So it's almost like they're creating their own MSP.
Mm.
Um,
Which is slightly surprising given the trend we've seen with other companies, particularly HPE, towards that more kind of white glove consultancy, managed services piece.
I think it varies massively between companies. So Dell is very, kind of, it likes to do direct. It does very well in the US with that because in the US, direct sales are important. It also largely takes that attitude over here, even though, there's probably a bit more channel going on over here.
There's much more channel going on
Yeah,
over here.
yeah, but it's still, like, relatively does quite a lot of direct sales here,
Mm.
depending on the size of the company, depending, on where it's parented, that kind of thing. HPE, once again, a bit more direct in the US, but, uses a bit more the channel, but whereas clearly IBM is putting all its eggs in the, "Do you know what? We'll just have effectively a channel company that we used to be look after it for us, or
Mm.
another channel partner of your choice." So yeah, it's interesting for them. It's interesting for people like me who kind of go, "Oh, this is very interesting. A company is doing a thing," but it's probably, like I said, it's much less fundamental than HPE's split from HP Inc.
Yeah.
It's not splitting in two, and all the idea that it was splitting in two is just rubbish. But that's completing this year, in 2021, and it'll be interesting to see kind of where it goes. But it's of interest to nerds like me who watch the M&A field, and probably less so everyone else.
Mm. So moving on to hardware, 2021 is likely to see the usual slew of hardware announcements, product launches, laptops, smartphones, tablets, things of this nature. Uh, but more than the launches themselves, what I'm really looking forward to is actually going back to trade shows and conferences and whatnot, and being able to actually physically attend events and expos and things like that.
Oh my goodness. Me too, so much. So when this whole thing started, I attended a virtual conference held by Appian, and I was like, "Wow, this is all right." I tell you what, by the time I was on my second one, I was like,
Over it.
"Oh, very over it." And then the third one wasn't too bad. It kind of depends on the sort of like proportion of person standing on stage in an empty room giving a speech,
Mm.
to, "Oh my god, these nausea-inducing graphics." And, like, we need to strike a balance between the 2. Also, why, oh why, oh why are these conferences that would normally be spread over 4 or 5 days now going on for, like, 3 weeks, some of them? It's mad.
Looking at you, AWS reInvent.
Yeah, please, my gosh, this is just like, no, let's not do that because, Yeah, we don't need it strung out over that amount of time, really, in my opinion. But for me,
If
the
anything, condense them more. Just do it like Netflix and drop all of your conference programming in one block and people can binge it or just pick what they want.
yeah, or like, maybe over a couple of days, that's fine.
Mm,
But yeah, no, there's no reason to string it out like that, I feel. Not least because actually one of the main, like, important parts of a conference is missing right now and cannot be replicated,
mm,
virtually, which is networking, and I really don't think
absolutely.
actually until this year I appreciated how much that is, like, kind of just catching up with people over coffee to get their take on, on the big announcements, see if, kind of my feeling is reflected by everyone else, if there's stuff that I hadn't thought of, or,
Mm,
I have been at events where you also get the feeling of the room where you've got all the delegates who are mainly customers, some partners, that kind of thing. Big announcements, you get to find out instantly whether they have gone down well, or not.
yeah.
There's a lot of clapping goes on at conferences. If there is a second when there is no clapping and, an announcement has been made, then the company holding the conference has a big problem.
Not always, actually, because I think, the clapping is pretty much the baseline, particularly US conferences where the first, like, 4 rows will be employees and senior people who will be contractually obligated to flip their lids at any kind of slightest announcement. When you know that a company is really dropping something interesting is when they make the big announcement and there's an audible gasp that ripples around the auditorium, which I've only witnessed, maybe 1 or 2 times, uh, but it's something to behold, and that's when you know that, serious moves are being made.
Yeah, gasps are different to silence though, because I have sat in a silence,
Yeah.
awkward silence followed by
Yeah, please clap. Yeah, that's never fun.
No.
Um, but yeah, it's the expo floor that I am probably most looking forward to getting back to though, because that for me is where you can really take the temperature of the customer base and the actual users, seeing which booths and which stands and which areas are getting the most attention, speaking to the actual delegates on the floor, speaking to the kind of representatives from the various partner companies that are there. It really gives you a sense of what the market is feeling and doing in a way that virtual conferences, as you say, really can't.
Yeah, and also scheduling. For those of
Yes.
us not based in the US, I don't know how much I enjoy, kind of doing random hours in order to cover conferences.
Mm.
It's all not ideal. So yeah, I mean, we're possibly reciting journalist problems here,
One
but
one thing I will say though on that note, and I think this is something that applies to delegates and customers and fans as much as it does to journalists like us, is I really appreciate that all or certainly most of the sessions and talks and briefings and whatnot are made available after they're initially streamed, which is something that I really hope companies continue going forward once they're able to restart physical conferences. I do hope they keep the option to tune in virtually, and I
yeah.
really hope they keep the trend of putting recordings online after they've happened live, so that for people who aren't in the US or even people that just don't have the time to watch them live can still tune in and can still take advantage of all that great content and that great insight that is delivered at these kind of events.
Yeah, it makes the whole thing, a lot more accessible. That said,
Yeah.
there are some companies that seem that they're probably never going to go back to physical conferences. Yeah, in 2021, I think a lot of them are just kind of working on the assumption that it's not going to be possible, especially not when they would normally hold their conferences. I am pretty sure that Citrix will never go back to holding an in-person conference. That's certainly what the holding page on Synergy looks like for now. We'll see, have to see probably in 2022 or definitely in 2022, kind of what the scenario is because they're not doing 2021. So I don't know,
Mm.
Adam, we may have to hold on for another 12 months before you can go and get some more socks.
Oh, that's such a shame. Although I should take this opportunity to give a quick shout out to Veeam, who very kindly actually sent me some branded socks after I published my column bemoaning the lack of them due to the lack of conferences. I'm actually wearing them as we speak. So thank you very much to Veeam for these lovely socks.
See, I need some more men's t-shirts to wear about the house because nothing is ever in a small woman's size.
Well, that is it for our New Year's predictions episode. We will be back next week with your regularly scheduled programming. But until then, have a happy new year. Don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter, follow us on all the socials, etc., etc. And we'll see you next week.
Bye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.